Once upon a time there was a beautiful unicorn named Stardust who lived in a mystical forest full of magic and wonder. Stardust loved exploring the ancient trees and crystal-clear streams that flowed through the deepest parts of the forest. One sunny morning, Stardust ventured farther into the forest than she ever had before. The trees were taller here and they blotted out much of the sunlight. Stardust felt a little scared being in this dark part of the woods all alone. She wished her best friend Moonbeam the unicorn could be there with her. As Stardust continued on, the forest grew darker and quieter. Not even the birds were singing in this part of the woods. The air felt heavy, as if filled with magic. Stardust came around a thick cluster of trees and gasped at what she saw. Before her was a circle of massive, ancient trees that looked like an entrance into another realm. The trees glowed with a pale magical light and the long grass in the center of the circle swayed gently. Stardust peered between the glowing trees and saw a shimmering pool of silver water. She could hear the soft tinkle of fairy laughter coming from within the circle. Stardust couldn't believe her eyes. She had stumbled upon the fairy ring, a place where it was said fairy magic was the strongest in the forest. Stardust hesitated, wondering if she should turn back. But her curiosity was too powerful. She had to explore inside. Stardust took a deep breath and stepped into the fairy ring. The air felt electric, making her mane stand on end. The laughter grew louder as tiny fairies appeared all around her. They flitted through the air on glittering wings, smiling at Stardust and beckoning her to come play. Stardust pranced over to the shimmering pool and gazed into its depths. She could see the twisting spires of a fairy castle down below. A fairy with long rainbow hair fluttered up to Stardust and introduced herself as Queen Felicia, the ruler of the fairy realm. The queen invited Stardust to visit their world below the pool. Stardust couldn't believe it. She was being invited to the legendary fairy kingdom she had heard tales of but never dreamed she would see. With excitement rushing through her, Stardust accepted the queen's offer and followed her into the magical pool. Stardust felt a tingling sensation as she stepped into the pool. Everything shone around her, enveloping her in light. When she emerged, Stardust found herself in a stunning underground cavern lit with crystals. A shining city lay before her, with spires rising high above. It was the fairy kingdom. Stardust walked through the streets lined with tiny fairy houses. The fairies invited her to try fairy treats and join their dances. Stardust had never had so much fun. She played for hours with the fairies, but soon began to feel homesick for her own forest. Stardust asked Queen Felicia if she could return home. The queen smiled kindly and said she could. But she warned Stardust that the forest above was changing and not as she remembered. Stardust felt worried by this, but she missed her family too much to stay. The queen led Stardust back to the portal. After a sad goodbye, the unicorn returned through the shimmering pool to the forest above. Stardust was shocked by what she saw when she emerged from the fairy ring. The warm, bright forest she loved was gone. In its place loomed a dark and threatening wood. The trees appeared angry, their branches like claws reaching toward her. Shadows stretched between the trunks. Strange sounds filled the air, screeches and howls Stardust had never heard before. What could have happened while she was gone? Stardust remembered the queen's ominous warning and shivered. She had to get back home before nightfall if she wanted to make it safely. With the fairy ring gone, Stardust was unsure which way led out of this eerie forest. She chose a direction at random and started trotting swiftly, the creeping shadows making her pulse race in fear. Strange creatures peered out to watch her pass. Stardust broke into a gallop, desperate to outrun the darkness. She wove between the trees, getting more lost with every step. The snarls around her grew louder, close enough to nip at her heels. Stardust burst through a wall of brambles in panic. She skidded to a stop just before tumbling over the edge of a sheer cliff. Stardust peered over the cliff's edge into the gloomy canyon below. A river churned at the bottom far out of reach. She was trapped. The creatures chasing her scraped closer, their eyes flashing in the shadows of the trees. Stardust whirled around, her horn glowing bright to keep them back. She had to make a choice, stand and fight, or take a leap of faith. An idea struck Stardust as she glanced down the cliffside. Vines draped down the rock face within reach. If she could grab one and hang on, she could climb down to the river below. With a determined look, Stardust backed up and got a running start. The creatures lunged for her just as she bravely leapt over the cliff's edge. She snatched a vine in her mouth and slid down toward the river. The creatures above howled in rage at having lost their prey. Stardust's heart pounded as she rappelled lower. But her horn lit the way, keeping her safe even in the darkness. Stardust landed on the rocky shore beside the rushing river. She had made it out of reach of the vile creatures. But Stardust could tell she was far from safe. This shadowy canyon was devoid of life. Stardust had never felt more alone. She desperately wished Moonbeam was with her. She could really use her best friend's bravery now. Stardust realized she would have to be her own source of courage to get back home. She followed the river downstream, hoping it would lead her out of the canyon. The cliffs rose high on either side, blocking out any light or sign of life. Just as Stardust was losing hope, she saw a faint glow ahead. She hurried toward it and discovered ghostly mushrooms clinging to the cavern walls, lighting her path with their pale glow. Energized by this sign of magic, Stardust ventured deeper. Perhaps the mushrooms would show her a way home. Finally, Stardust reached the end of the canyon and turned a corner into a wider cavern, and what she saw left her breathless. Towering crystal formations glittered all around, reflecting light like prisms. Lush gardens of magical plants and flowers grew beneath them, filling the cavern with life and light. Familiar constellations twinkled down from the cavern ceiling, painted like a night sky. Stardust even thought she heard Moonbeam call her name on the enchanted wind. Overjoyed, Stardust realized this was the heart of the magical forest she called home. The dark forest above had just been an illusion cast by wicked creatures. Her forest was still as beautiful as she remembered. Stardust followed the crystals and stars toward home. She stepped into a clearing and there stood her cottage, just how she had left it. And who was grazing in front of it but her beloved friend Moonbeam? Stardust called out her name and the two unicorns joyfully reunited under the starry cavern ceiling. Stardust excitedly told Moonbeam all about her adventures in the fairy realm and the dark forest. Moonbeam said she had been so worried when Stardust didn't return. The friends stayed up late into the night talking by the light of the crystals. Stardust was thankful to be home again with her best friend. She knew now that no matter how dark and scary the outside world seemed, there would always be light and hope to light her way if she just believed.